From the creators of the popular science show with millions of YouTube subscribers comes the Minute Earth podcast. Every episode of the show dives deep into a science question you might not even know you had. But once you hear the answer, you'll want to share it with everyone you know. Why do rivers curve? Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms? And why do so many more kids need glasses now than they used to? Spoiler alert, it isn't screen time. Our team of scientists digs into the research and breaks it down into a short, entertaining explanation, jam-packed with science facts and terrible puns. Subscribe to Minute Earth wherever you like to listen.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
Hey everyone, Ray here. Many of you are familiar with the incredible story of the Dunkirk civilian mobilization during World War II, but there's another remarkable story of a civilian-led maritime operation where Denmark ferried thousands of their Jewish citizens to safety in a mass-scale rescue right under the noses of the Nazis. From award-winning author Tim Brady, A Light in the Northern Sea, Denmark's incredible rescue of their Jewish citizens during World War II meticulously explores this nationwide resistance movement that reads like a thriller. Denmark's nearly 8,000 Jews survived, but it wasn't a miracle. It was the combined achievement of a nation refusing to stand by, using clever subterfuge and increasingly daring acts of sabotage. Among the rescued was Niels Bohr, the world-famous nuclear physicist who would go on to help Oppenheimer build the bomb at Los Alamos. Publishers Weekly calls this book illuminating, an inspiring and suspenseful history that showcases grassroots efforts to stand up to tyranny. A Light in the Northern Sea from Kensington Books is available everywhere books are sold, and you can learn more at tim-brady.com. Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 555, Allied Blood on French Soil. Last time, the post-Pearl Harbor meeting in Washington, Arcadia, saw the Americans and the British agree to land in North Africa. They would take Vichy territory and then move east to finish off Rommel. It might not have been the second front Stalin wanted, but it was something. It was a start, and the Americans were still gearing up, besides needing to test themselves before taking on the world's most successful army in history in Europe proper. Working together in a way that the Axis never would, when the three task forces arrived at their destinations along the North African coast, the Western Allies came with 107 transports, just over 107,000 troops, and almost 10,000 vehicles, and 96,000 tons of supplies. By December of 1942, the number of troops would be over just 1 million. Britain provided most of the naval power, and the U.S. provided most of the air and manpower. As previously stated, the British would conduct the Algiers and Oran, the center and eastern landings, respectively. Escorting the landings, shielding them from Axis air power and the U-boat threat, were British warships, which meant pulling them from the wider war, along with Gibraltar's Force H. Thus, 6 British aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 1 battlecruiser, 1 monitor, 9 cruisers, and many support vessels hovered and buzzed around the transports. At this moment in time, the British Navy was still king. As for the Americans conducting the Western Task Force, landing at and near Morocco, this came with 5 carriers, 3 battleships, 7 cruisers, and support craft. But practically everything about the American task force was being built from scratch. The naval crews were mostly reservists and new recruits. The transport and cargo ships were recent converts. The exception to this was the American pilots, well trained and taken care of, as FDR had been pumping money and his expectations, if not his hopes, into his country's air arm since the second half of the 1930s. Of course, some of those pilots were flying the outdated F-4F Wildcats, but fortunately, there was also some of the respected SBD Dauntless and Grumman TBF Avenger bombers. The British in the war since the beginning had their transports move as close as possible to shore, risking land-based artillery attacks. The men, the country as a whole, were tired from the war, but they were also experienced. They came ashore in their LCAs or landing craft assault, the Americans on their LCPRs and LCVs, carrying personnel and vehicles. The Eastern Task Force, landing at Algiers, was composed of the 11th and 36th Brigade groups from the British 78th Division, along with 2 regiments of the U.S. 34th Division and No. 1 and No. 6 Commando Battalions, with, again, integrated American members. Once this force came ashore and consolidated, it would then be designated British First Army, and it would have Crusader III and Valentine tanks. However, none of the units, nor their commanders, had experience in North Africa. They and their commander, Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, would use tactics long since eschewed by 8th Army. Like the Americans, it would be a learn-as-you-go process. And then there were the Americans. Their country was still mobilizing practically everything. Their doctrine and tactics for armor, anti-tank, amphibious, and airborne were being figured out as they went. Still, with America's affluence, the soldiers would be over-equipped and relied too much on materiel, and as tactics were still being sussed, they would quickly become flummoxed with unexpected situations, of which the Germans were sure to provide. The basic American unit for an amphibious landing was the Regimental Landing Group, RLG, an infantry regiment of combat and support personnel, of about 5,250 troops and 440 vehicles. This also came with a platoon of 5 M3/M5 light tanks. Broken down further, the RLG was made up of 3 battalion landing teams, BLTs. The idea was to use 2 BLTs and keep the 3rd back in reserve. The Center Task Force had the U.S. 1st Infantry and 1st Armored Divisions, but its medium tanks were the older M3 Lees, not the M4 Shermans. Many of those FDR had sent to Britain after the fall of Tobruk. As the Americans were about to learn, their tank units lacked sufficient infantry support. Gleaming from the moonlight, the equipment of the Western Task Force, having come from Virginia, the men of the 3rd Infantry, 9th Infantry, and 2nd Armored Division's equipment was the latest in American ordnance. M4 Sherman medium tanks, the new M5 Stewart light tanks, M10 tank destroyers, new AA guns, high-speed artillery tractors, M7 Priest self-propelled 105mm howitzers, and bazookas. Of the planned 1,698 Allied aircraft over the 3 landing zones, the eastern zone, furthest away from the combat, would have the least amount, while Oran and Algiers split the remainder evenly. While the Americans excelled at field artillery, its fighters not so much. The new P-38 Lightning was modern, but it still had bugs to be worked out. The P-40 Warhawk's performance was mid-level, but only made worse with the coming low-altitude combat over North Africa. Still, as various areas became Allied-controlled, these air forces, like the ground forces, would be transferred further east. Ready to resist this massive amphibious force were the Vichy forces. French Morocco had 55,000 troops, Algeria 50,000, and Tunisia, initially demilitarized, now had 15,000 troops. Besides which, at Casablanca was the battleship Jean Bart, a light cruiser, 7 destroyers, and 8 submarines. At Bizerte in Tunisia and Oran in Algeria, they had their own destroyers and submarines. But what gave the Americans pause was the fully operational battleship Richelieu at Dakar on Africa's west coast. Supporting that battleship were 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers. Well, that and the 75mm coastal guns, and there were 358 artillery pieces in total, all kinds, and 500 aircraft scattered along the coast. The only good news for the approaching Allies was that Vichy only had old armored cars and light tanks, but they lacked ammunition and fuel. As for any Axis forces to contend with, that pretty much came down to the 574 Italian and 298 German aircraft based at Sicily and Sardinia. As for the Italian Navy, respectable enough on paper, but between a lack of fuel and political timidity, they were not expected to be a serious consideration. The British, but more so the Americans, were hoping to come ashore so quickly with overwhelming numbers that the Vichy leaders would not resist. When first coming ashore, the men would be protected by sea-based naval guns and carrier-based air power, but once territory was taken, the artillery would be brought ashore and air bases created or French bases taken over. As for getting to the point of Torch engaging Axis forces, once the Eastern Task Force landed and took over at Algiers, instead of driving all along the coast to Tunisia, it was hoped the force would be able to leapfrog most of that distance, getting back aboard their transports. As for Franco Spain, just in case he was displeased with Operation Torch and decided to take the Straits of Gibraltar for himself, Operation Backbone was set up, which would have 2 British divisions sail directly for Spanish Morocco. The idea being, if you take from us, we will take from you. The Western Allies were counting on the help of anti-Vichy resistance and the good offices of U.S. Consul in Algiers, Robert Murphy. Again, France would be treated like an ally, but it had been French authorities that kept the international kettle of Christians, Jews, Muslims, Europeans, indigenous Arabs, and Berbers from attacking each other. Thus, their cooperation was paramount, which meant the last thing Washington or London needed was de Gaulle's Free French involved. Thus, he and his were kept completely out of the loop. When the Western Allies came for North Africa, there would be 2 Italian divisions in western Tripolitania, Libya, just to the eastern side of Tunisia. That way, if Tunisia fell to the Allies, northwest Libya was still safe for continued Axis use, i.e., feeding Rommel's army. Of course, for Berlin in 1942, it was all about the Eastern Front. Rommel was never really given enough of anything, thus his eventual defeat. But there was still the western half of North Africa in French hands. And of all of the places an Allied army might land, the Germans nor the Italians expected French North Africa, as it would violate French neutrality, causing them a headache that Hitler wanted to avoid in mainland France. Having said that, Berlin had created Case Anton, the occupation of metropolitan France, but for Hitler, this was a worst-case scenario. Surely the enemy would make for Malta, Sicily, Sardinia, or even southern France. But French-controlled North Africa? No. The advantages were outweighed by the headaches that would come. But not only was Algeria a target, but Algiers was selected as the future location of Allied Forces HQ. And of course, Algeria was important to take, to then move on to Tunisia. As D-Day approached, the Western Task Force's Rear Admiral Robert Giffen, an American, gave a speech to his men. It was tradition. It ended with, "There is glory enough for us all." When the Navy chief paraphrased this speech, he shortened it to, "Come on, boys, let's pretend they're Japs." The planners of Torch guessed that the enemy would guess that they would be going to Malta. So during November 7th, the Allied ships purposefully passed by their landing zones, apparently going to the island. But that night, they turned around and headed for their true destinations. No surprise, during these last few days, the Italians and Germans had planes and submarines out in force. But little came of this. That morning of November 7th, an HE-111 torpedoed the American transport Thomas Stone of the Eastern Task Force. The rest of the ships went on. The destroyer HMS Panther was bombed, but it also kept going. As for the infantry aboard Thomas Stone, they had to wait for a tug to come from Gibraltar, which is when the men on board, the U.S. 2nd Battalion, 39th Infantry Regiment's commander, Major Walter Oakes, he and his were slated to be some of the first to go ashore, decided otherwise. They were still 150 miles from Algiers, but they had their 24 landing craft on board. Oakes decided he and his 700 men would leave at dusk, escorted by the corvette HMS Spey, and head right for their landing area just in time to join the fight. Of course, they did not make it. The landing craft were not meant for that kind of a journey. Engines broke down, they got lost, and men were becoming seasick, which is when the Spey took them on board. But Admiral Cunningham, old ABC, when he heard of this adventuresome attempt, admired Oakes's notably courageous decision. Meanwhile, the situation on land throughout French North Africa, along the coast, was pretty much the same as had been on Major Oakes' landing craft. Stomachs were churning, some men losing their lunch. But these were men of the leading military of Vichy. Resistance members in country heard on the BBC a French voice repeatedly say, "Allo, Robert Franklin arrive." The battleship Texas broadcasted the message, "Allo, Marco." And then it played the French and American national anthems over and over. At 1:20 a.m., now November 8th, a French voice claiming to be Eisenhower said, "The Americans have arrived to liberate French territory." Then a French-speaking Roosevelt's voice came on saying, "Mes amis, have faith in our words. Help us where you are able. All men who hate tyranny, join with the liberators who at this moment are about to land on your shores. Vive la France éternelle." U.S. Consul Robert Murphy was certainly running around that night, making promises and threats as appropriate. Anything to minimize the Allied deaths during the amphibious landings. Also that night, in the Moroccan capital, Rabat, one of Robert Murphy's converts, General of Division Émile Betoit, arrested his superior, General de Division Georges Lecroux, at 1 a.m. because he would not play ball. Then he arrested General of Division Louis Louela, Morocco's air commander. And yet, before Louela had been arrested, he called Vice Admiral François Michelier in Casablanca, who refused to be a part of this. Then Michelier ordered his men in Casablanca to maximize readiness to resist. But then it was General Betoit's turn to be arrested by the French Resident General of Morocco, Charles Noguet, at 2:30 a.m. The general had come to Noguet to persuade him, but Noguet would not turn. He then alerted the troops at Meknes and Marrakesh, as their commanding officers were still loyal to Vichy. Not that Betoit's work was done. Before he was arrested, he had contacted a commander, Colonel Jean Petit, at Port Ute, and ordered him to support the American landings. Petit got busy in his preparations to do this, and the local leaders were happy to hear this. But then, Vice Admiral Michelier contacted Petit and countermanded Betoit, telling the colonel to resist the landings. To wit, Petit ordered his men to fire on the Americans when they came. Meanwhile, in Algiers, the resistance members waited for Allied insurgents to join them. They would take over various buildings together, but no insurgents nor guns from U.S. Consul Robert Murphy showed up. But as the saying goes, the play must go on. So medical student Jose Abouker and his 376 comrades rode the buses throughout the city, taking over the Central Telephone Exchange, the Governor General's HQ, and the main police station. Arrested was Algeria's military CNC, General of Corps Louis-Marie Coutts. By 3 a.m., command and communications were impossible for Vichy officials. But as Abouker and his mates had not received additional arms from the United States, their lives were now in jeopardy. What they needed to happen was for the Allies to come ashore ASAP and take over. The arrests continued. Just outside Algiers, General of Corps Alphonse Juin was arrested by anti-Vichy officers while at his home. Then the American Robert Murphy arrived, saying a huge American invasion would commence within the hour, invited by General Giroux. Juin, not sure which way to jump, was allowed to call CNC Darlan, who then called Pétain, Vichy's leader. But while this was going on, Vichy police arrived and arrested U.S. Consul Murphy. As for Pétain, he was currently talking to FDR's envoy, stating America's invasion, but also its peaceful intentions. Pétain, though, fearing German presence on the European continent over American presence in North Africa, stated that France would resist any invaders and severed relations with the United States. The planners for Torch would have 4 landing parties west of Algiers, Algeria's capital, and 2 to the east. As for the port itself, there was to be a landing there as well, to prevent the destruction of port facilities and to take control of the capital once the French possession surrendered. Dubbed Operation Terminal, it would start with HMS destroyer Broke ramming the boom protecting the harbor to get inside the southern basin and would then unload U.S. troops at the Quai de Dieppe. With this done, next the destroyer HMS Malcolm would make for the Mole Grand. Once landed, the Americans would establish a perimeter and then move out, taking various facilities along the waterfront. It was hoped that either through speed or French hesitation, the operation would be successful without loss of life. But that's not what happened. As this limited strike would take place hours after the landings to the east and to the west of the capital, the French would obviously be alert and looking for such a decapitating move by the now enemy. And around Algiers were 13 coastal batteries, 7,000 troops with light tanks and armored cars, with 2 airfields nearby, each having fighters and bombers, and another 8,000 troops just outside the city. Terminal would either be a brilliant, daring stroke or an unmitigated disaster. As U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Swenson, commander of the 662 Americans of the 3rd Battalion, 135th Infantry Regiment, with 3 British officers and 74 Royal Navy personnel approached the port city, it was hoped that the earlier, further out landings would pull French troops from the port city, thus weakening its defenses. They did not. As the 2 British destroyers approached Algiers at 1:40 a.m., November 8th, the port city's lights went out. Replaced by 2 powerful searchlights, they soon found the enemy destroyers, and coastal artillery opened fire. Between the lights ahead in their eyes and the shells coming at them, the destroyers missed the harbor's entrance twice. But coming around again, as this was their mission, the Malcolm was hit at 4 a.m. Now on fire, she also had 10 dead and 25 wounded aboard. The Malcolm withdrew. Nevertheless, the Broke stayed on the scene and during her 4th attempt found the entrance and ripped through the boom at full speed. Pulling up to the mole Louis Billiard, her assault team disembarked at 5:30 a.m. The mole, electric power station, and nearby tank farm were taken. The French had resisted, but so far only with small arms fire. Things were going well after a rough start, but at 8 a.m., French artillery opened up again, and their only target this time was the destroyer Broke. She was driven away after taking several hits. But before she left, her siren wailed, calling back the troops. But only 60 men returned. The Brooke departed at 9:20 a.m. To be sure, the destroyer was still being fired upon, but 6 Albacore dive bombers silenced the guns on the harbor's northern edge. Lieutenant Colonel Swenson and the men still with him fought off the Senegalese infantry. Fortunately, again, they were only using rifles. But with each attack that was pushed away, the Americans were getting lower on ammunition. Hopefully, the 168th Regimental Combat Team of the 34th Infantry Division would arrive soon to rescue them. But at 11:30 a.m., with no help in sight, French light tanks and armored cars closed in. Swenson and his men surrendered an hour later. All told, between naval and army personnel, the Allies had just lost 22 men with another 55 wounded, and the HMS Broke sank the next day due to the damage. Meanwhile, further west, another such mission was being carried out, Operation Reservist, but this one at Oran. Again, the idea was to take and hold the port facilities, thus ensuring their use after an Allied victory. But again, as the French knew they were being invaded, the 4 shore batteries and the 31 French ships in the harbor were ready. As the British sloops HMS Walney and HMS Harlan moved closer to the harbor, the French guns exploded. Before the Walney reached the jetty, 189 of her 393 American infantry of the 6th Armored Infantry Regiment were killed. At least 100 more of them were wounded. The Royal Navy lost 113 men, with another 86 wounded. Despite this, the Walney landed a small group of American soldiers. But like at Algiers, they were quickly overrun and had to surrender. In almost all respects, Operations Terminal and Reservist failed. Almost. Though the port facilities at Oran were destroyed by the French, the defenders at Algiers had been so busy with Lieutenant Colonel Swenson and his, they forgot to carry out demolitions. Zooming out, though, these 2 failed missions did help with the larger landings further away from the 2 target cities. But these have to be designated as costly diversions. Still, between these 2 operations and the 6 other larger landings, the Allies were now on French soil.